Welcome along to session 3. We are expecting quite large numbers tonight, so if you're able to make sure that your microphones are kept on mute and that your cameras are switched off during the session, that just helps with the bandwidth a little bit. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat pane, as lots of people have been doing already, and you'll notice that we popped a link to the chat, a link to the form in there. We are being asked just to kind of collect the information on local authority attendance, so we don't need any of your personal details. It's just the local authority that you work for, and there's also an option there if you are a student at university, or if you're maybe supply working across multiple local authorities. And if you don't fall into any of those categories, you can just select the other option there. So this session tonight, it will go on until 5:30, and it is being led by myself, Yvonne Somerville, and my two colleagues, Maria and Jacqueline, who you'll hear from a bit later on. The session, just like the other ones, will be recorded in order to allow practitioners to access the training who've maybe not been able to make it along. It will go up as part of our professional learning offer, and hopefully will be useful if you do want to go back and revisit any of the content that we cover tonight. We've tried to make it as interactive as possible, so there will be opportunities for you to stop and reflect and join in at different points in the session. Just to go over some of the accessibility features, so if at any point tonight your slides disappear or the sound disappears, try leaving and rejoining. First of all, that often kind of helps sort a lot of the problems first of all. You'll also notice on the slide that you have got some different options that you can adjust the settings to make it better for yourself. So if you want to be able to view the slides in high contrast, for example, or if you want to click the three dots at the top, you can make it appear as full screen. You can also turn on live captions. We know that some people are joining us from school settings where it might be noisy in the background, so that might help you. If you do want to join in at any point tonight, you can use the raise hand function. That just lets us know that you want to join in, or you can use the chat. And we also ask, you'll notice that there is a button at the top of the screen that says take control or request control. Please don't click that. That ends up kind of messing up the slides for everybody. So we ask that you please don't click that. Now, similar to the last sessions, we are using the car park just as a way to kind of capture some of your thoughts, your questions, your comments. So if at any point tonight you do want to put in a question, you can use the chat function, or you can put it into the car park, and then that way we can keep a note of the things that are going on. We can stop, we'll look at different points tonight and kind of bring in the different questions as appropriate. Sometimes just with the kind of sheer number of content that we've got to go through and the number of questions that come in, we don't always get a chance to go through all of the questions, but we will always try and take time to come back to them at the beginning of the next session, like we're going to do just now. So there was 2 questions from last time that we did try to kind of cover a little bit, and we thought it was just really important to start the session again, kind of reinforcing this. So one of the questions that was in the car park the last time was around when we were talking about being careful about the language of using bigger numbers and talking about bigger and smaller numbers. So hopefully you will see on the slide here that there should be different numbers up here. I don't really know what's happened to the animations here, Jacqueline, but it's maybe not uploaded the way that I had it. So hopefully if you click again, there we go. So you can see that there are different numbers on the screen there. Now you will know your learners best. We know that very, very young learners often think of big relating to size. So if they think about the big cup and the small cup, they're always going to think about it in relation to size. And so when we talk about the big number and the small number, very young learners can often end up relating that thinking to numbers as well. So in this example here, if I was to say, oh, what is the biggest number here? They would maybe pick the number 3 because it looks the biggest. And similarly, if I was to use words like, oh, tell me which number is the lowest number here, a child might say that it's number 7. Because it's down at the bottom, and so they're not necessarily getting that concept about what we mean by big and large and greatest. And so I think the point from last session was just to be aware of the language that you are using, and the key thing is that you're not causing misconceptions around the language that you're using. So if I was to say to a child, tell me which number is the smallest, and they said number 5, not to just disregard that as, oh, that's a child that, you know, doesn't understand largest and smallest number, but actually asking them, well, why do you think 5 is the smallest number? And kind of using the answers that they give to try and work out why have they got a misconception. Is it because they're linking it to size and it's a vocabulary misunderstanding, or actually do they not understand the difference between comparing different numbers? There was also a question about should we be using the greatest number, and I think that's definitely something as you go further up the school you definitely would be relating to that one. So yeah, you definitely would use that language. The other question that came in was, at what stage do you use change side, change sign in operations when we're talking about missing numbers? So this was going back to missing number calculations for addition and subtraction. And again, we hope that one of the main points that you take away from these sessions is that in order to develop a real solid understanding of number, children need to understand the process that they are using, and they need to have multiple experiences of using it in lots of different ways. And unfortunately, one of the things that we often find is that learners who have kind of been taught tricks or shortcuts don't always have a real understanding of what they're actually calculating. And it's also worth being aware that sometimes in primary we can teach younger learners a trick or a shortcut. So things like change side, change sign, or 2 negatives make a positive, thinking that we might be helping learners to remember how to work out something. But we have to be aware that these, just because it works lower down the school, it doesn't always necessarily translate into more complex math. So again, Jacqueline, if you're able to click, and hopefully another one shall appear on the slide here. So you can see here is an example of more complex algebra. And this is where a trick like change side, change sign can become really confusing for learners, because what do they do in a situation like this? Are they adding 5, in which case they would get the answer that it's 30? Or do they think, well, I need to multiply by positive 5 because I need to change that from negative 5 to positive 5, so I need to multiply it, in which case they would get the answer of 125. Or for some learners, they know, well, that is a multiplication at the beginning, so I know it needs to be division, but then there's that confusion of, well, are you dividing by positive 5 or are you dividing by negative 5? And actually, this is where, we've taught a very easy trick like change side, change sign. But actually, what does that mean? Which sign are you changing? Which side is it going to? And the article down at the bottom from Mr. Barton's blog there is really good at kind of talking about some of these misconceptions that we maybe teach in primary, in the hope that we kind of make it easier, but actually we end up complicating it, and secondary teachers end up spending a lot of time unteaching these tricks. So it's really important that we are teaching for understanding rather than sort of shortcuts and tricks. So that was just another one that we felt was really important to come back and address tonight. Now, before we begin this session tonight, we are going to ask you to complete this starter task. So what do you know about a half? And I'm going to give you a moment there just to note down all the different things that you know about a half. Just while we're giving you a little minute there, it looks like there's a few people that are having issues with being able to see the slides. Hopefully if you leave and rejoin, it should pop up for you, and the same if you've lost the sound, although I appreciate you maybe can't hear me if you've not got any sound. So thinking about some of the different things that you might know about 1/2, some people might have noted this down as a notation. And when we mean notation, we mean the way that it is written down. Some of you might have linked it to some of the other facts that you know, so things like a percentage or a decimal fraction. Some people might have drawn, 1/2 of an object or something pictorially represented. So, you might have drawn half of a shape. You might have a fraction of a shape shaded in, or you might have shown it as a fraction of a quantity. And then some people might have written it down as an equivalent fraction, so something like 2/4 or 5/10 or something like that. So this is quite a good open-ended kind of starter activity that you can do. Depends on the age and stage of your learners, will depend on the kind of type and range of answers that they give to you. And during the session tonight, we're going to go over all the different kinds of forms and presentations that fractions come in, but we do quite like these kind of open-ended starter activities. It's particularly good if you have quite a large spread of abilities in your class, because you can pose a question like that, and then depending on where the children are at their stages of learning will depend on the answers that they give you to something like that. Now, for the next activity, we are going to ask you to go on to Menti, and you can use the code that is on the screen there, or if you've got a secondary device, you should be able just to scan the QR code and it'll take you to there. And we're going to ask you to have a think. When you think about teaching fractions, decimal fractions and percentages, what are 3 words or phrases that come to mind? And we'll have a look at what people are saying in a little minute. So I'll give you a moment just to complete that there. Screen there. So the bigger the word is, the more people have said that word. So interesting, some of the words. So your words like challenging, complicated, tricky, confusing. We do find that fractions and decimal fractions and percentages can be one. We see words like nightmare, dread, anxious, uh-oh, struggle coming in there as well. Pupil confusion, fear. So hopefully tonight as we go through, we will help you to address some of those. Also some words there like cake and pizza that we might again be able just to kind of sway your thinking a little bit maybe as we go tonight on some of these concepts. And lots of words in terms of link to the actual vocabulary, and things like equivalence, proportion, divide, sharing, practical activities. So again, good to kind of see all the different thoughts coming up there. We'll leave that open, so if you've not had a chance to add your thoughts to that, you can do, and hopefully Jacqueline will be able to share the slides again for us. If we take a little moment to actually consider, what do we mean when we talk about a fraction? Hopefully you can type into the chat, what do we mean when we say a fraction? What is it? Some people say a part of a whole, an equal part, a proportion of something, division, part of something. So it's important that our learners understand that a fraction is a number in its own right, and a number line can be a really useful way of demonstrating this. You can see here on our number line that we've got 1/2 shown. It's important that they do see how it is linked to the number line, and you can obviously place different numbers on the number line, and you'll see different examples of that as we go through tonight. We know that it also can be thought of as a proportion or parts of a whole. So in this example, you can see that there are 3 orange parts out of the 4. We can see that there is 1 part that is white. We can also talk about it in terms of, you might say things like, 2/3 of people in this group are wearing glasses, in terms of the whole that's there. We can also think about fractions in terms of sharing. So for example, these strawberries, we might share them between 2 people. And obviously this can become more challenging as learners progress with different amounts of fractions. And we can also describe it as a calculation. Now, the link at the top takes you to a paper on the National Research and Development Centre. It has lots more information on these 3 concepts. It has been designed for adult learners, but it's actually quite a good one. It goes through a lot of misconceptions and why learners can find fractions really challenging. So it is a really good one to have a look at after the session. And as with number and number processes, when we were talking about that multiple representation, again, that's a key message for us tonight, that it's important that learners see fractions in multiple representations. So throughout the session tonight, we're going to look at how you can explore these in different ways. Now, if you've joined us for our previous sessions, you will know that our numeracy professional learning resources that these sessions are based on were written to complement the messages within Realising the Ambition. And so tonight, the first part of the session is considering how can we make our spaces, interactions and experiences rich and good in terms of developing children's understanding of fractions, decimal fractions and percentages. So first of all, when we think about the different types of spaces that we have, we're considering spaces that are outdoors and indoors, thinking about how we can use those to extend and consolidate learning. We want to make sure that the materials are open-ended so that they can be used in lots of different ways as children play, explore, question and investigate. And on the slide here, you can see here are some of the open-ended resources that you might find useful to provide when you are hoping to encourage children to explore fractions. When we think about interactions, we have used this slide previously in the number and number processes, but you'll notice that we do keep it in across all of the sessions. We feel it's really relevant. We're still using these questions to encourage that exploration and investigation. These questions can be really open-ended. I notice and I wonder, and they're really helping children to develop these skills. It's also important that we take the time to consider the misconceptions that we can sometimes cause with the interactions that we use. So you'll see some of the things on here. One kind of confusion that comes for learners is the fact that, up until now they've been learning that the bigger the number, the bigger the bit, whereas fractions is the opposite of that. You might have spotted on Twitter over the weekend that there was a certain national newspaper that was being picked up by maths teachers for their use of their fraction headline, which stated that the infection rate had gone down from 1 in 56 to 1 in 53. So maybe some of those people might need to come along and join some fractions professional learning there before they're editing their headlines. And we also want to make sure that, we're not saying things like, oh, who wants a bigger half? Mathematically that's not correct. Often hearing children and adults talking about 1 over 2, a number at the top and a number at the bottom, which again is kind of not mathematically correct, and we'll talk a little bit more about the notation of fractions later on. And as we saw in the word cloud, a lot of people for fractions, it's tricky, it's confusing, there's misunderstandings, and so we need to make sure that we are using our language to talk about fractions in as positive a way as we can, so that we're not adding to the kind of idea that, fractions are really tricky, or don't worry, I didn't like fractions either. So, making sure that we are using that positive mindset towards maths at all times. Now, sometimes when we begin to introduce fractions, we can jump right in to, getting them to colour in parts of objects or, cutting things into half without actually exploring, well, what do we mean by that concept of a whole? And understanding that fractions are the whole being split up. So it's really important that we do take that time to explore across the environment, what things are whole and what things can be split into parts. So you can see some of the different things that you might be using, jigsaw puzzles, tinkering toys that, can be taken apart and put back together. And also using the environment, what can we see around us that has parts on it? If I look out my window, I can see that there's a tree which has got leaves and branches and a trunk, but all together it makes a tree. I can see a house that's got a roof and windows and a door, and all together the whole creates that house. So again, just using the environment to explore what we mean by these terms before we begin to jump into kind of formal referencing of fractions and fraction vocabulary. Now on this slide here, we're looking at the different experiences that we can provide. Now at early level, we are very much focusing on halves. And we want to be able to make sure that we're giving learners lots of different opportunities to investigate and play. And this is right across the curriculum, not just specific for the early level. We know that they need that rich and varied experience if they're going to be able to develop that good understanding of fractions. So you can see some of the examples that are coming up on this slide that can be used in an open-ended way. So you might be doing things like splitting up items at things like snack time, and talking about the language as you do that. You've cut the bit of toast into half, or you've cut the apple into half. Hopefully you will be able to have different materials available within your setting so that learners have the opportunity to, to fold and to cut things like paper and ribbon, exploring things that can be a whole that can then be split and shared into smaller parts. If you've got things like sand and water within your setting, are these marked with different fractions on them? In the early level, have they got the halfway line marked on it? Do they have a different range of different types of containers that they can, 2 of these buckets make 1 of these and that sort of thing as well? Things like dough, if you've got a dough area available, again, it gives the opportunity for learners to cut in half and explore sharing and making different equal proportions. And then also making sure that we're building on experiences that children already have. So where do they see and know about fractions in the world, in their environment? So things like, a full moon and a half moon, half time at the football, the toys half price in the shop, they might have half and half bread, that kind of thing. And also using links to environment outdoors. So where can they see and explore halves and fractions in outdoor and in nature? And as you go through the presentation tonight, you will notice that there is not very many circular objects up on screen yet. So you do hear an awful lot of talk about pizzas, cakes, pies when teaching fractions. Absolutely okay to use it, but as you'll see in the presentation tonight, we need to go beyond this. This applies to all levels, and over the course of the presentation, we will show you different ways that you can move on from just using pizzas, cakes and pies during your fractions lessons. One of the good kind of resources that you have at your fingertips is the learners themselves, involving them in sharing activities. So getting them to arrange themselves in different ways, different layouts. And, you might have a group of children. Can they divide the group into half, then bring that group back together and ask another child, well, can you half the group of children in a different way? Activities like this help to prove that there's more than one answer. It helps to remove the stigma that, in maths we're just searching for one right answer. And also when you are asking questions, what was the same when we did it? What is different? The likes of the button activity there, the buttons have been halved in lots of different ways, but what's the same and what's different when we've done that? And again, using these kind of open-ended questions are helping learners to justify their answers, to reason with what they've done. And so we're really promoting that mathematical discussion from a very, very early level and making sure that we're giving learners enough time to kind of think and look and reason before they're given their answers there. Now, the last little bit from myself tonight, I'm going to ask you to go back to the Menti, and hopefully I will be able to move on to the next activity for us. And what we're going to ask you to do now is have a think about when you think of fractions, are there other areas of numeracy that link to fractions? So I'll give you a little moment there just to have a think about, are there other areas of numeracy that link? And hopefully the next one will come on for you. And I'll be able to share the results in a little minute. So you can see some of the answers that are coming up here. Links to division and multiplication skills, links to time, symmetry, links to shape, and as we go through the session tonight, we are going to have a look at how fractions do link to other areas of numeracy and maths and how you can make links across the numeracy and maths organisers. So I'm going to hand over to Maria now, who is going to talk to you a little bit more about this.
Thank you, Yvonne, and good evening, everyone. You're very welcome. So we're just going to spend a little bit of time considering some of the sort of prerequisite skills and thinking about how explicit we need to be when we're teaching some of the language that's associated with fractions. So we're going to move on to think about 2 different ways that you can approach when we're thinking about teaching division. So we've got equal sharing and we've also got equal grouping. Being able to group and share is a really important skill to develop, and it starts at early level. It's really clear as practitioners that we're clear what the difference is between the definitions, and to make sure that we provide a balance of experiences for both. In my experience, sometimes learners understand the concept of sharing more easily, and they can kind of grasp that because they've maybe had previous experiences of when they've had to share out items, and they're quite quick to tell you whether they've got more or less. But actually grouping can be a little less common perhaps, and sometimes this could be viewed as a wee bit trickier, and that's why we're promoting that we need learners to experience both approaches. And in that last Menti that Yvonne was sharing with us there, we could see that multiplication and division was mentioned, and we can see how this is really closely linked to multiplication and division. And when we're looking at these examples that I'm sharing on the slide just now, we're obviously thinking more going into first level and beyond, but what we are stressing is that the groundwork at this level really paves the way for these skills to develop effectively. And if you are working with learners who are maybe at first and second level, and they're saying to you, or you're observing that fractions are challenging for learners, it's worth maybe going back a little bit, revisiting some of the learning associated with grouping and sharing, and maybe doing that through using some concrete examples and materials or pictorial representations. We've provided on the screen here a very brief descriptor of both grouping and sharing and a bit of an example to match, but we will go through this in a bit more detail in this session, and we will revisit it in the next session too, and I'll talk about that a wee bit later on. So in essence, sharing happens when we know the number being divided and the number of groups, but we don't know the size of each group. And grouping happens when we know the number being divided and the size of each group, but we don't know how many groups. And when we think about how this might look in practice, if we're modelling this or working with learners, both examples will look quite differently as to how the learners will approach them. And the representations that go along with them, so that the calculation would be recorded differently as well. So you can see here in example 1, that would be recorded eventually as 8 divided by 2 equals 4, whereas example 2 would look like 8 divided by 4 is 2. So please don't worry at this stage if you're a wee bit confused about this. We are going to go over some more examples, and we'll touch base on what this looks like in multiplication and the division session, which is coming next. So if we move on, we're just going to provide another couple of examples. So what you're going to see here is just an example of grouping. This is grouping because we know there are 9 cows, and we know that those 9 cows will go into groups of 3. But what we're trying to work out how many groups of cows we will have. So it involves collecting an amount into equal groups and counting how many groups can be made. And what I would be promoting really is use whatever objects or concrete materials you've got access to, and that could be indoors or outdoors. Maybe use the learners themselves, as we saw Yvonne explaining in the previous slide, get them to model this, so asking a group of 9 children to form groups of 3, and how many groups do we have. So just using the materials and the resources that you have to hand. What we are promoting is providing lots of different representations, and to revisit these so that you're sure that the learners are developing that deep understanding that we're trying to promote. The next example shows that we have 8 eggs. And in this example, we are saying that they need to be in groups of 2. So we're working out how many baskets or groups we will need. And in this example, we're beginning to introduce the idea of remainders, and that notion that we can't always perfectly share out exact amounts, because in real life, that's not how things work. And this can provide really interesting conversations and discussions with learners. What might they suggest happens when there are remainders? It's quite an interesting conversation to be part of. And although what we're not saying here is this is part of formal learning at this stage, but it is worth modelling this idea so that later, when this is more formally taught, the learners have had an experience to think back to. Okay, if you can move on. We're just going to look at the next example here that looks at sharing. And in this example, we're sharing out 6 tennis balls between 3 children. So we're working out how many balls each children will get. So we're splitting the balls equally to determine the size of that equal share. And again, just another example of sharing coming up. And in this example, we're sharing out 12 apples and we're sharing them between 3 teddies. We're working out how many apples each teddy bear will get. And it's really important, as obvious as it sounds, it's really important to ensure the word equal is included when we're thinking about approaches like questions like this one, because what the learners could do is they could share out the apples and give one teddy bear 6 apples, another teddy bear 2 apples, and teddy bear 3 could get 2 apples. But what they've not done is they've not shared them equally, and it's important to really emphasise that we're talking about equal shares. So the word equal makes sure that we've got the same amount of apples for each teddy. We're going to stop there just for a minute or two, just to give you a chance to think back on everything that I've spoke about and what Yvonne's shared with you already, and to give you a few minutes just to think about the grouping and sharing notion. Think about a different question that you could make up for whatever level and stage that you're working with just now. Please put them in the chat pane if you can, and maybe share a question that you could be using for grouping and one for sharing. And we'll just stop for just a minute or two, but it would be lovely to see some examples of these. So please feel free to share some examples in the chat pane, and I'll just pause for a minute or two. Great, thank you for the people who are sharing. And I just checked the car park there. We don't have any major questions coming up at the moment, but we will just keep checking in to make sure that there's nothing there that we've missed. So thank you to the people who are sharing, and please continue to do so. That's really great. And as I said earlier on, we will come back to this again because we know that definitions can get a bit mixed up and there can be some confusion about the two different approaches. So we will come back to this in the next session. We're going to move on just now. Again, we're thinking about the prerequisite skills here. And one of the other things we need to provide opportunities for is for learners to see the links between doubling and halving. And we can do this in lots of different ways, and that's what we're promoting. We're thinking about all those different approaches. So we could use some dice and domino games. We could use some dot patterns. We could use number sequences, as you can see on the slide. We can use finger patterns, and there will be lots more that you've used or that you can think of. What we're saying here is that it's really important that children are developing their knowledge of doubles to 10 at early level. And we can also start thinking about extending that to include near doubles. So it's questions along the lines of, and you know your learners best, so you'll know when these questions are appropriate. So if you know that 4 and 4 equals 8 and 5 equals 10, how will we work out what 4 and 5 equals? And can we use that previous learning to work out 4 and 5? And how did you know that? Can you show me that? Can you explain that to me? Can you draw a picture? Can you use concrete materials? So all of those questions about making sure the learners are able to demonstrate their learning, and that's when you can pick up on where challenge and support might be needed. And we've mentioned already, if we move on to the next slide, that it's about developing that notion of halves in lots of different ways, and that includes in lots of different curriculum areas and lots of other learning activities that you're planning. And symmetry is a perfect opportunity to do that. We've mentioned measure and time as well, and that was also mentioned in the Mentimeter, which was shared earlier. But even thinking about it as a much wider topic, so are we looking at nature, are we looking at seasons, are we looking at maths in the wider environment? When we're doing literacy, we're thinking about halving some of the letters that we're using. So it's just about that everyday opportunity that we can use to develop that notion in lots of different ways, because what we're looking for is that real deep understanding. So it's just about using any opportunity that we have to explore and deepen that understanding. Another area that we need to revisit and make sure that we're providing explicit teaching and learning opportunities for is that exploration of the vocabulary associated with one, whole and half, and what really does that look like? And we spoke earlier on, Yvonne mentioned earlier on about it being whole items having different parts, and now we're moving into looking at that through shape. So again, it's asking those, planning for those questions or looking for opportunities to extend the learning by saying, how do we know? Do we know for sure that that is a half? How do we know that those parts are equal? And what could we do to find out for sure? And what we're really promoting here is that the learners should be given opportunities for that practical hands-on experience. So we're providing opportunities for the learners to learn by doing it themselves, because that's when they'll get that experience that will stay with them, and revisiting that as often as we can. And again, we've said already, using different shapes and objects. So here we see we're using rectangular shapes and rectangular objects. And really what we're promoting here is allowing the children to see the link between the fraction and the whole. It also lays the groundwork for fractions being a number in their own right, as we mentioned earlier on. And we're not suggesting here that we're using formal number lines at early level, but we just want to show you how laying out objects in a line might actually really help the learners make the links as they progress through their learning. And later on, you could maybe come back and revisit this type of activity. Okay, another important part of the learning at this level is that language of equal and not equal, and what's fair and what's unfair. And we know that children will have their own idea of what fair and unfair is, so it's important that we take any opportunities to make sure that they've got a real understanding of what that looks like. And asking questions similar to the ones that are on the slide just now are really important, because what that gives us as practitioners is that individual assessment of where the pupils are in their learning, and things that we might need to go back and revisit as part of our kind of teaching of the language. But we're doing this through very visual approaches where possible. So in this example, we're saying the sandwiches can be shared equally, but how could we share the other items equally? And that's the exact question that I would ask of the learners. And to prompt that a wee bit further, or to scaffold that, what could we do with the cookie? What could be done with the extra apple? And leaving that for the learners to discuss and think about and share. Would that same approach work for the juice? And what might we need to do and think about when the juice comes into play? This provides real formative assessment opportunities for us as practitioners, because these types of activities really provide that context for deep discussion and investigation, and that's what we're promoting. It can highlight potential misconceptions, but can also allow for effective support and challenge. And it's also quite fun. And when we're thinking about the idea of half, we know that learners will have come with their experience and have heard people around them, their family, their friends, talk about a half in everyday life. They might hear it related to their age or time or sharing out food. But that importance again of the halves being equal needs to be taught, modelled and really emphasised. How many times do we hear phrases such as, I want the bigger half, that Yvonne mentioned earlier on? So we're thinking about, we really need to make sure that we're teaching that a half is one of two equal parts. And sometimes we might be doing this before we introduce any numbers. So we're doing that number-free approach. We're using objects, we're using paper, shapes, counters, cubes, so that the learners have got that hands-on experience, but they can also visualise it. And the point that I would like to make here is non-examples are really important as well. So when we think about that notion of that's not a half, this again provides us with a really good opportunity to discuss what learners might need to do to make it a half, and how will we know for sure. So it's all of these types of questions that will really move the learners on. And activities like these can be a really good way to ensure that depth of learning that we continually go on about, but also allow learners to apply their thinking in lots of different ways. And just the last slide from me before I pass on to Jacqueline is really about to highlight this website to you if you're not familiar with it already, maththroughstory.org. It's a great website. There's a main resource page, but there's also lesson ideas. So the book that's highlighted there, you can't see, it's quite small, but the doorbell, that introduces the concept of division with remainders. And on the website, you'll get some lesson ideas provided with examples of a suggested activity, a plenary, a reflection. There's also images of how practitioners have used that in practice. And it might just give you a starter for 10 that will help support you with your own planning. So it's a great website to use so that we're using stories in a context. So it really provides that rich context for learners. So I'm going to pass on to Jacqueline just now. Over to you, Jacqueline.
Thank you. So we're going to have a break now. I think it's well needed. That's been a lot of listening that you've had to do. We are trying to make it quite interactive, but you'll appreciate that it's difficult to do that virtually. However, delivering it virtually means that we're able to reach, 250 odd people. So that's great. But what we're going to do is we are going to have a break, 5 minutes. In that you can go away, you can just take a screen break, or you can choose to stay at your desk, whatever is comfortable for you. But those of you who are maybe sitting at your desk, we just ask that you draw 1 quarter in any way that you want to do. Just the first thing that comes to mind, please don't think too much about it, but just draw 1 quarter. The other thing that we'd like you to do is, if you haven't already, if you could just complete the registration link. As we said, there's no personal details. It's just basically which local authority you're at, or whether you're at university, or whether you're on supply or something like that. So it's just really quick. It just really helps us with our numbers, because if we can show that these are popular sessions, then it kind of means that it helps our argument for putting more of them on in the future as well. So if you complete that, that would be amazing. So that is 43 minutes past. We're actually doing quite well for time. So we'll actually make it 50, so that's giving you 7 minutes, and that should hopefully give you enough time to actually make a cup of tea or something if you wish as well. The registration link is in the chat, if you can access the chat. Oh, that's great, brilliant. I know sometimes it takes a wee bit to update. So yeah, we'll come back at 4:50 and we'll see you then. Enjoy the short break. Ruin the music atmosphere there. It's quite nice just sitting here listening to it. But I'm going to go on so that we can hopefully get finished on time, if not a couple of minutes earlier. So we asked you to draw a quarter. Some of you will have had time to do that. Some of you might not have had a chance. Please don't worry. But we just thought it would be a nice kind of activity, because what we were wondering is if, hold on, it's just taking a bit to move. Did you draw this? If you drew something like this, just stick a yes in the chat. Or if you drew this, either of these, stick a yes in the chat. Yep. Yep, loads of yeses. Or this. Yeah, so you can see where we're going with this. It's the first thing we think of. But unfortunately, that means that we tend to use these type of examples all the time with learners, and I think we've all been guilty of it at times. So what we really need to do is rethink how the examples that we're giving learners, and try and think out the box a wee bit more, because otherwise they develop quite a fixed mindset of what fractions are. So it could be that you, in this example, this is slightly different. So for 1 quarter, actually it's the unshaded part that shows the 1 quarter, and that's okay as well. Or it could have been an irregular shape, so not just your typical square, triangle, rectangle, all that sort of the circle. So it's thinking again, as I say, out the box, or maybe even just turning the square on its side can make a big difference, and sometimes that can throw learners off, but that comes back to us not really giving them enough examples of that. So what we need to do is think outside the box when we're giving them the examples of fractions, and also really highlighting that it's not always the shaded part, because this can really develop a fixed mindset about what fractions are. They tend to see fractions as only the shaded part, but actually the unshaded parts are fractions as well, and that's really important. And also this last image is a little bit more complex, and you could ask learners whether this has been split into quarters here, but actually the best sort of thing to do is let them go away and experiment, give them something to use and get them to cut it up, put it into different bits, measure it, lots of different things they can do to see whether or not that actually is split into quarters or not. So another task, as I said, we tried to make this as interactive as possible, given that, I'm giving spoilers there, given that the situation that we're in. What I want you to do is draw this 2x4 square, or 4x2 rectangle, sorry, on a sheet of paper. And what I want you to do is shade in 1/2. Now, initial thoughts, don't try to be clever about it, just initial thoughts, shade in 1/2 of that shape. And I'll give you a few seconds to do that. And I'm just looking at the comment in the chat about the forest school, so doing a leaf and 3 sticks, and I love it, and you'll see how that links in something that we're going to do later on. Great. Okay, I'm just going to move on just for time purposes. So here are some of the ways that you might have chosen to shade the shape or not shade the shape to demonstrate 1/2. It tends to be this middle one or this one in the left is what learners and us as teachers go to, but actually look at the different ways that we can show one half as well, and also because this is 8, so actually 1/2 is 4 squares, so it's just really important to again look at the different ways of doing things and not just go for the first way that we think of doing it. Now, earlier on, we talked about pizzas and cakes and that it is absolutely valid to use them, but actually we need to think beyond that. So again, it's fine to use them examples, but what we're going to do is just show you some different approaches that you can use. And don't get me wrong, I've been in the classroom where I've been thinking, the first examples that come to my head are pizzas and cakes, but actually there's so much more you can do. So you could use fraction strips, you could use number lines, some of this we've talked about already. It might be that you use mosaic tiles or cubes, or even just double-sided counters can be useful. I'll show you an example later on of how they can be used. Counting sticks as well. Lego, Duplo, great pieces of material that you can use as well. Outdoor materials, so I like that reference to that earlier on. And 10 frames as well, so you can see the 10 frame being used outdoors and the 10 frame being used with pictorial images here as well. So as we go through the next few slides, we're going to talk about how these can all be used. Oh, and also some unicorn in there as well. Multiple representations was mentioned earlier on. It was mentioned last session. We will continue to mention it. You'll get sick of hearing about it, but it is so important. And the top left picture here shows 4 different ways of representing 3/4. And this approach here is called a think board. And think boards are a really good way of developing learners' understanding of concepts in a much deeper way, rather than just always thinking about one example. We've got to think about it in different ways. And there's a link there that will, when you get the PDF of this later on, that you'll be able to click onto a great blog by Highland Council, which explains a bit more about what think boards are, but also gives lots of great examples about how they can be used, and not just for fractions, for lots of different concepts as well. Most of the other images here demonstrate fractions of a quantity, and these examples can be extended into larger quantities as learners progress into second level. So we've kept them quite basic today just for ease of reference and just to show you in the simplest terms, but you can scale it up if you've got learners working at a later on stage. In the outdoor example, and that kind of links into what was mentioned in the chat, which I loved, it is really important to highlight that 4 objects have been collected and 3 out of the 4 items are leaves, and therefore 3/4 of what was collected are leaves. And again, that can be extended into much larger quantities as well. And the last image on the right-hand side there shows 6/8. And the concrete and pictorial representations are really important in developing that understanding of equivalent fractions. But again, we'll come on to talk about that later on. So again, we're really making you work for your money today. It's your turn. So based on what we've said about multiple representations, what we want you to do is just take a few minutes. We'll give you 3 to 4 minutes just to jot down as many different representations as you can of 2/3 and try to think out of the box, just like we have in the last few slides. So we'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, I hate to interrupt the creative process. I'm sure some of you are getting right into this. Maybe some of you are just hoping I would just get on with it. But maybe you might have drawn a number line and indicated where 2/3 was in the number line. Maybe you drew an item and circled 2/3 of them. Maybe you wrote it in words. Maybe you showed it as an equivalent of fraction. Maybe you showed it as a kind of fraction strip type wall or a bar model. And in the first one there, you can see that we've got 2 shaded, and the second one, 2/3 are unshaded. And then in the bottom example, just a different way of showing that using either a fraction strip or using a bar model as well. So lots of different ones. There's probably other ones that we've not mentioned today, but we just kind of thought we'd go through some of those examples with you. What we like about this type of activity is, again, we've kind of mentioned this in the previous sessions, but these type of activities are really good for differentiation because the learners can access it in the way that's appropriate to them, but you can also use it as assessment because it will really help you to see what the learner is understanding and where the potential gaps in their understanding may lie, and that'll help you go back and readdress these things that they've not managed to quite grasp yet. It's also important to have a firm understanding of what the numerator is and what the denominator is, and I think it can be really tempting for us to refer to them as the top number and the bottom number, but it is really important that we are using proper names, and the more that they hear them, the more they'll understand them, and the more that they'll get used to them as well. The numerator essentially just shows how many equal parts we have, and the denominator shows how many equal parts are needed to make the whole. And I'll just click on, the BBC Bite Size has a really nice explanation, even if you're still sitting there thinking, I don't really know what she's talking about, or if you just want to show it to your learners as well. There's just a really nice video on there that's useful. Loads of really nice videos on Bite Size, actually. At this stage, we wouldn't be expecting you to refer to the line as vinculum, but we've just kind of noted that there for your own reference in case you're like, what's that called? But we wouldn't use that with learners, but it's just, I mean, they might ask you, and that's okay to tell them, but it was just for your own reference really today. So we continue to bang on about multiple representations, but they are so important of developing that deep understanding. So I can see already that the animations in this slide are out a little bit. No matter how many times we take it off and check them, it never quite works out the way we want to. But anyway, looking at fraction of a quantity, it's really important that the children have had a chance to work with the concrete materials, because this will really help them understand the meaning of the denominator and the numerator, rather than it just being viewed as a process such as divide by the bottom number and times by the top number. So in this case here, if you're finding 3/5 of 20, as they move towards the more abstract, then yes, they will divide by 5 and multiply by 3. But why are they doing that? Maybe they don't know. So actually it's important to have the concrete material. So they've got 20 counters that they can actually count out into 5 different piles and then count how many are in each pile. So in this case it would be 3. 3/5. So they would have 15 counters, 3 lots of 5, sorry. In this case, apologies, I'm getting emails from people saying they can't get into the session. This is where the multitasking doesn't work. I'm going to ignore those emails and carry on with this. So the other thing that you can use, so bridging from the concrete into the abstract, is a nice visual representation such as a bar model or a number line, because this can really bridge that gap. So once they're secure using the concrete materials and they can find quantities of amounts, then what you can do is move into this sort of approach. You can see here that the number line, we've got 20 that has been sectioned into 5 different parts. So it's been divided by 5, and 3/5 of this takes us to 12. And if we look again at the bar model here, it's divided into fifths. 3 of these fifths is 4 add 4 add 4, which is 12 again. And then this last section here is the abstract. So 3/5 of 20 is 20 divided by 5 multiplied by 3. And that brings us back to 12. So you can see how they all link. So that's the concrete to the pictorial to the abstracts. And if you're finding that they're really not quite getting the abstracts, take it back a step. And if they're still not getting it, take it right back to the concrete. And you'll find that that will hopefully make a difference as well. The other thing is we mentioned earlier on fraction walls, and this one has been taken from Toy Theatre, which is one of the online resources that we mentioned to you in the first session, but you can get these on other websites as well, and they can also make them using paper as we showed earlier on, or they can use bars or square paper in their jotters as well. Fraction walls are really good because they can help explore equivalent fractions in a much more visual way. They're really good. So if you look here, we've got this has been split into thirds, and you can see very easily that this 1/3 here is the same as 2/6, 3/9, and also 4/12. You can make that direct comparison, and that's why we really particularly like the bar models. But this can also go further, the fraction strips, this can also go further in that now you can see that there's 2/3, both of these highlighted, but 2/3 is the same as 4/6, 6/9, and 8/12 as well. So it's just that visual understanding can make it just easier for them to grasp. Number lines have also already been mentioned, but they can be a really good visual way of demonstrating equivalent fractions as well. So you can see here we've just got a simple number line which represents 1/2, and then you can show them other number lines and you can ask questions such as what's the same, what do you notice, and see what they come up with. And you can see there's a few extra number lines here that you can make the comparisons with as well. These are just a few examples, but you get the idea. And these number lines were taken from MathSpot, another website, a concrete manipulatives website that we mentioned before. But also using physical individual number lines can also be really helpful as well. So they might have their own laminated versions that they're able to make comparisons with, or whatever is right for you and your pupils. So when you do come to teach fractions, decimal fractions and percentages, it's really important to provide time to think about it. And as Yvonne said earlier on, think about where we see it in real life, everyday life. Go on a walk of the local environment, around the school, around wherever you are, and also look at things like news articles and headlines, watch adverts, because quite often there's percentages brought into them. And this doesn't really matter what stage learners are at, all of the learners will notice different things from all of these things that you're looking at as well. When you are teaching decimal fractions and percentages, it's really important to discuss that decimal fractions and percentages are just fractions written in a different way. Quite often learners don't make that connection, and if we can make that connection for them and highlight this and keep drawing attention to it, then actually they'll find that much easier as well. There's lots of examples using money, measuring lengths, measuring weight, that bring in decimal fractions, and really it's that kind of understanding of how it fits into an everyday concept that will help them develop that familiarity and see the relevance to life as well. We have included a stopwatch here because measuring time uses decimal fractions, but that's actually into second level. But it is also worth noting the importance of notation here because actually interpreting time in a stopwatch can be really difficult and misconceptions can occur quite easily with this. Sometimes time durations, for example, 2 minutes and 52 seconds can appear to have a decimal point as a divider between the minutes and seconds. So this has to be really clarified carefully. And if you're thinking, what is she talking about? Don't worry too much about it. We just want to highlight at the moment that there can be a wee bit of a misconception when it comes to decimal fractions and things like time and measured and money, because it doesn't work out quite nicely because it's not out of 100. But we'll cover that. We can look at that even in our regional sessions if that's something you want to investigate a wee bit further. So it's probably good to just think about what actually is a percentage. Percentage means out of 100, pair being the out of, and cent being 100. And when you do introduce new vocabulary, I think it's really important that you take that time to discuss it with the learners because sometimes we can be guilty of just pulling words out and expecting to know what it means or get to know what it means, but actually pick apart the word. What does it mean? Where does it come from? And there's a nice wee video, again, back to BBC Bite Size, that you can click on that will take you to a nice explanation of what a percentage is. But what we can't really emphasise enough is just making that link between percentages and decimal fractions using all the same approaches that we've used already for fractions. And you'll see over the next few slides how it can all be pulled together. So if you were going on, you're quite comfortable with the fractions, basic fractions, and they're ready to go on to decimal fractions. Keep making those links, and this is just one way that you can do it. So you might show them a simple 10 frame such as this, and you might ask them how many squares there are. So everybody just have a wee think. How many squares can you see? Okay, how many are coloured in now? So just have a wee think about that. Okay, so we've got 7. So how can we see this? So we can say it as 7/10. This is not new to them at this point. If you're introducing decimal fractions, learners should be able to do this. 7/10. It could be 7 out of 10. How do we write this? We can write it like this. And then when you're going to introduce the decimal fraction, what you can say is, well, another way that we can actually write this is 0.7. And this is called a decimal fraction because you would begin with tenths first of all before moving on to hundredths as well, but we'll talk about hundredths in a few slides as well. Making those comparisons, as I said, is really important. So you can see here that 1/10 is 0.1, 2/10 is 0.2, and this was just created by a learner using paper folded up into tenths. You could use 10 frames, you can use anything you want, it doesn't really matter. Number lines again. So, we were saying earlier on that fractions are a number in their own right. So are decimal fractions because they're just equivalents of each other. So it's important that it's not always whole numbers that learners are seeing on a number line, that actually they can see fractions, they can also see decimal fractions, and as we move on you'll see you can use them for percentages as well. Earlier on I talked about double-sided counters, so when introducing tenths, this is just one activity that you can do. So have 10 double-sided counters and work in pairs, and they can throw them onto the counter, and one person's red, one person's yellow. And depending on, it doesn't matter who goes first, but say for example you're the yellow person, then you've got to write down all the different ways that you could represent that. So you can see here the yellow person, 3 tenths, 3 out of 10, 0.3, 3 tenths. And then the person who's the red counters would have to do the same. So it would be 7 tenths, 7 out of 10, 0.7. And I can keep doing that, just till they kind of get used to that. It's just one activity. Again, it might not work for your learners, and that's fine. It's just to give you some kind of starter for 10 with this. To make it a bit more exciting, a bit more interactive, you could play fraction bowling as well, rather than just going straight to workbooks and, it becomes a wee bit boring straight away. It's just one way of making it a bit more exciting. So you could have learners work in pairs or small groups, take turns knocking down the pins. So 10 pins, standard game of bowling, and it's up to you whether they get 1 or 2 rolls each time, how close they stand. You can judge that depending on the ability of your learners to bowl. But what they have to do is they need to record the total number of pins that they score and then see who's the winner. So if you see here that the person 1 hit 4 pins, so they got 4 out of 10 pins, which is 4 tenths, but actually that can be simplified further to 2/5. And again, that depends on where your learners are. They might not be at that, it might just be 4 tenths, and that's enough. That's okay at that point. If they're further on and they understand their fractions and equivalent fractions, then you can move on to that, and that's fine. The second person, 1 pin, 1 tenth. Third person, 5 pins, 5 tenths, and again, equivalent of 1/2. And the last person was great and got 10 pins, which is all of them, which is 1 whole. And that would be 10 tenths. So that's that. What I would like you to do is, can you convert these amounts into a decimal fraction and a percentage? Now, we won't know how you've done, so just have a go. Draw the wee table on the right-hand side here where it says decimal fraction. So if you know that it's 4 tenths, 1 tenth, 5 tenths, and 10 tenths, what is the decimal fraction going to be? And if you want to extend yourself, try and complete what the percentage is as well. Okay, I'm just going to move on just because of time. So the equivalent decimal fractions would be 0.4, which is 40%, 0.1, 10%, 0.5, 50%, and it would be 1 whole and 100%. I'm going to move on now just to hundredths. So when they are secure with tenths and not before, don't feel the pressure to rush through that planner. If they can't do tenths and they're finding that difficult, then if you move on to hundredths, then it will just become much more confusing for them. But when they are ready, just using a similar approach, this time using a blank 100 square. I'm not going to go through the whole process again because it is just the same, but essentially how many squares are there? Count the coloured squares. How can we see this? 6 hundredths, 6 out of 100, 6 100ths, and if you're introducing decimals, then you can say this is 0.06, and this is how we write this as a decimal fraction. And then once you've done all that and you're looking to introduce percentages, you can use the whole same approach, and this time it's 6%. A really good task that you can do with learners is which is bigger, 0.1 or 0.01, and how can we prove this? And one way that you can prove that is by using, you can use like a 100 square that's been divided into tenths and also 100ths, and you can overlap them, show them next to each other. So the one on the left shows 1 tenth, the one on the right shows 100th. And you can repeat that with different amounts. So which is bigger, 0.6 or 0.68? What you'll find is that learners tend to say 0.68 because they think that the 6 and the 8 refer to 68, which is bigger than 6. But actually, that's not the case. And again, it's proving it. So you can see here very visually that's that. So you can just have, again, laminated blanks of these where they colour them in, or the online manipulatives are absolutely fine to use as well for that. So it's just, we just kind of wanted to show you how you might approach this just from the very beginning, and lots of examples and practice, concrete materials, visual materials, all of that is so important here. So in this activity, this is just a kind of fun activity, you could give learners a 10 by 10 grid, so a 100 blank grid, some coloured pens and pencils, and then give them that opportunity to just create a creative, colourful, multicoloured design with, you could limit them. You could say only use 4 colours, use 6 colours, or use between 4 and 6. Again, it's up to you or up to them, whatever the situation is. This is just one example of what learners could come up with. There's lots of different options as well. But once they have completed their design, then what they can do is complete this table. So what colours have we got? What are the numbers that are shaded? So there are 20 blue shaded, which is 20 100ths, And again, if they're ready to move on to equivalent fractions and simplifying it down, that would be 1/5. And the decimal fraction for that would be 0.2, and the percentage would be 20%. So I'm going to give you just a minute to pick one colour and see if you can complete the table for this just now. Not the whole table, just pick one colour, because we are a wee bit short of time now. And I like the celebrating in the chat there. It's good to celebrate the maths. And also, if you didn't get it, don't worry, because it's all about just taking part and enjoying it today. There's no pressure on anyone. That's good to hear Mr. Thompson saying that he did this with the Primary 5 class last year and they loved it. It's introducing that personalisation and choice as well. You're giving them a bit more control over what they're doing as well. Probably some of you are frantically counting the screen right now, I'd imagine. The link at the top there is just a wee link to some nice decimal maths games. Again, they will not all be appropriate for your learners, but it's just something that you can dig into and have a go at. I'm just going to move on just because of time. So as I say, these slides will be available afterwards. So if you want to go back and complete that activity, you're more than welcome to as well. Again, this slide goes back to multiple representation, and these types of activities are a really good way of getting learners to make the links between fractions, decimal fractions and percentages, which, as we've said quite a lot, will really help to deepen their understanding. The activity on the right hand side, the kind of diagram here, is really good for differentiation, because learners can be given this one task, what do I know about 3/4, and again they can access it where they're able to. Some might be starting to, see that their 3/4 is 3 times 1/4. Some might be able to say that it's 0.75. It just depends. But again, it's good for assessment because you can pinpoint what they do know and what they're able to do, and then that'll help you plan their next steps as well. The examples on the right-hand side here are all written, but actually you could also invite your learners to use concrete or pictorial representations of it too. Again, it's just what you feel is appropriate. The part on the left here just shows different ways of writing all of these different amounts, so 0.68, 68, 100, 68%, so on. At second level, learners wouldn't be expected to formally be adding fractions, but you can see here that actually they can make natural connections. So that's there's 6/10 here. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6/10, and also 8 100ths. If you add them together, that makes 68 100ths. Do appreciate we're going quite fast. So if you are thinking, oh my goodness, this is really fast, don't worry, you can take your time, go back to it, and again, we can explore things in the regional sessions should you want to just go a wee bit deeper into anything. At second level, learners should be working towards calculating really simple percentages of a quantity, and again, making those connections is so important. So what I want you to do is just think in your head, what is 10% of 50? Just have a wee think. What is 10% of 50? Just think in your head, write it down what you want to do. Okay, so 10% of 50 is 5. Now, if you know that 10% is 5, then what else can you work out knowing that? So in this example here, if 10% is 5, then 5% is going to be half of that, which is 2.5. 1% is going to be 1/10 of that, so that would be 0.5. And 20% would be twice as much as that, because 20% is twice as much as 10%, and that would be 10. So you can see proportions coming in here as well. You can extend this even further. 25% would be 20% at 5%, which gives us 2.5. I'm going to stop talking now because I think actually as I say it out loud it gets more confusing. And then you can see once you've got these basic percentages, you can actually extend that just out a little bit further and find more uncommon amounts. Now, we're not saying that they should be able to be calculating these at second level, but actually just knowing these basic percentages can help them make those connections as well. And what you're seeing here is that there's really close links being made to the number bonds. So again, if learners don't have strong number bonds, then they will not be able to, they'll find this challenging. So you might need to go back to a wee bit of revision. Of course, we're trying to keep the number up as daily as we can as well. I notice that somebody in the chat is just saying, where can we access these slides again? We'll post them later on this evening. I'll put the PDF up onto the Padlet. You'll be able to access that, and in a day or so, we'll add the recording up as well. So Would you rather is a really good way of assessing what learners have learned about fractions. So what you can do is you can provide learners with 2 options and they need to decide which one they would rather have. They may be used to playing fun games like that as well, but what they need to do is they need to justify their decision using the calculations that they've carried out. What I would do is if we had a wee bit more time, I'd ask you to pick one of these and pick which one you would rather have, but we don't have time. But you can just see how that goes and what the example of that might look like. Again, lovely to see the link to outdoor learning earlier on, which was great. And you can see here, we all often promote ways of taking maths outdoors, and we do have a full session planned next year on this. But as we're talking about fractions, decimal fractions and percentages, we thought it was worth showing you just some examples of how outdoor spaces can be used in this area at the moment. And the link at the bottom there provides a recording of our outdoor learning webinar. However, if you're coming to that session, I would just say leave it at the moment. You'll have enough to think about, and we'll explore this further and pick it all apart a wee bit more when we go to that webinar. And again, you can see that those connections are being made all the time here. So 1/4 being 25% and also being 0.25. But also coming back to, if you know that 1/4 of 20 is 5, what else do you know? Well, you know that 2/4 is 10, 3/4 is 15, and so on. But also that 4 times 5 is 20, 5 times 4 is 20. And you can really see the link here between the multiplication, division, and fractions. Earlier on, Maria talked about fractions through some stories at early level, and actually that's not limited to early level. We've talked before about the Maths Through Stories website, which is really good and has some really good examples for older learners as well. So these are just some of them. All I did here was a simple filter for fractions, and these results come up. And again, some you'll be able to get hold of, some you'll not, and again, some just might not be appropriate for your learners. It's just down to what you think suits. But what they can do is they can really challenge some of the misconceptions around that. So tortoise is saying to gorilla, I got 1/16 and you got 1/8. 16th is bigger than 8, so I got a bigger piece than you. So that's not quite true. Why is that not true? And so on. This slide here is just some links you'll be able to click on when you see the PDF later on.